Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 28. And today I am excited to be joined by fellow podcast host who runs the awesome Coding After Work podcast, Jessica Engstrom, all the way from Sweden. So welcome to the show, Jess.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Could you give our listeners a quick intro into your background and what it is you do? And obviously feel free to plug your podcast, which I'm really enjoying listening to, by the way.
Oh, you are? Thank you. That's so nice. Well, I actually started in the developer world, but I kind of quickly realized that what does it for me is the experience the user is having. And it kind of came around remember when Windows Phone was announced? Microsoft came out with this Metro design language, as it was known back then. Later changed, but all of a sudden everything was so easy. If I wanted to play a game, I went into the Game Hub. If I wanted to send a message, I went into the Message Hub. Kind of like, yeah, why isn't it always working like this? That's kind of when I went down the rabbit hole of UX and user experience. And for the podcast, we started a code-heavy user group because we found there are so many awesome user groups, and especially in Stockholm, which is the capital of Sweden, we have a lot of really good user groups. But what we noticed is that even if we get to listen to all the great speakers about the newest, coolest new framework or hack or whatever it is, sometimes you can't use that at work, or your boss or the system doesn't allow you to do the latest beta or whatever of a new cool thing. And when you get home, you kind of don't take the time. Sometimes maybe you have a family or other stuff. So we wanted to create a place where people could actually come and try those things out. And that became Coding After Work. And then we started to speak at conferences, me and my husband. And we got to talk to so many amazing people all over the world. And we thought, why not share that with the world? So that's how the podcast came to be.
That's fascinating with your user group because the user group I run, .NET Oxford, is very much people do talks. So to actually have that interactivity that you're talking about, where attendees can actually code and try out these new technologies, it would be something that'd be really interesting to try out.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we wanted because, again, those groups are amazing because we get those tidbits. We get to know if this is something for us, but we never really get to try it out. So we try to catch that because at least here in Sweden, the consultancy companies and software consultancies and stuff like that, they have R&D days or they give their developers time to actually explore new things and stuff. But if you are a regular developer who don't have that type of working environment, where do you go then? So it started out like that. And we started out with just .NET, but that kind of grew very fast because nowadays it's basically if you have an issue, someone will have encountered that sort of issue before, or you have someone to bounce ideas of. So currently, of course, due to a pandemic, we moved to Twitch. So we do more streams right now. Let's see what happens next year.
I think you've inspired me. So an upcoming .NET Oxford meetup, just decided we're going to do one that's more interactive and more like kind of a hackathon kind of thing. Just getting members, they're not just sitting with headphones on like in the background, they're actually getting their hands dirty. I think that'd be fascinating.
Awesome. Yeah, it's so rewarding, actually, to be able to, even if it's just an hour or two, I think we used to do 4 hours, but people come when they can, right? So we did from 5 to 9. But people come after work and they do a little coding and then they go home.
Well, it's quite interesting. A few months ago, a UK meetup group, Mini Hack, which is organised by Kevin Smith and Paul Michaels, they kindly invited me on to be a guest judge. Basically, it's like a mini hackathon kind of event. And it was just fascinating attending that and seeing attendees actually writing code. They used Zoom and went into different breakout rooms. So the different teams went into different breakout rooms. I just found that fascinating, actually, just seeing that extra interactivity.
Yeah, it's awesome because you can, if you have that little nagging question that's maybe hard to Google, you can just ask someone.
Exactly, yeah. And also it's kind of, I know I struggle when watching a live talk where I just want to pause it if I need to stop for a sec because I don't want to miss something.
Yeah.
And And we produce the videos anyway, so it's kind of, I guess, what's the incentive to attending rather than watching the recording, where if you can have that extra interactivity, that becomes a lot more motivational to attend. So yeah, we'll try it out in an upcoming meetup, which we're booked up until next year, so it'll be maybe March, we'll see.
Awesome.
So before we delve into UX, a quick listener mention, which goes to Dustin Morris. And he's Dustin Morris on Twitter, @DustinMorris, and he says, really enjoyed this podcast. You can tell Callum speaks from a lot of real-world experience and great dev tips at the end as well. And Dustin is referring to the last episode where Callum Lidington joined me to chat all about event sourcing and event-driven architecture. And I think we scored a new record for how many technologies we mentioned in that episode. So thank you, Dustin, for the tweet. So UX. I'm quite embarrassed to say this, but other than applying a bit of common sense, I really don't know that much about UX methodologies at all. So I'm kind of in your capable hands in this episode.
You kind of boiled it down there. It's common sense. Sometimes I feel like, why doesn't it just work? A really good UX for me is those you don't have to think about. They just work. You go in an application and you have done whatever you set out to do. And you don't have to think about it. So sometimes I kind of disappoint people when they ask me, do you have some really awesome UX page or application you can tell me about? No, because they're too good, so I don't remember them because they just work. And it's not...
That foils my next question then.
Sorry. No, if it just works seamlessly, there you go. That's what you want. But I think the easiest way to get started is just to remember that there is an end user that's going to use your page or application. Because sometimes we tend to forget that because we have a massive backlog or we have a tight deadline or we just want to get it done. But there is a user. We are doing it for the users. I kind of like to quote Tron. He fights for the user. And I kind of like that.
I've not seen that film in a long, long time. I'll have to rewatch.
There you go. Maybe it's time again.
So I wasn't joking when I said I don't know that much about UX at all, but doing a little bit of reading and Googling beforehand, it seems like quite a common term is this personas and things like that. And I do have a ton of questions about just things like prototyping tooling and telemetry, which I'm hoping we can dig into a bit later. But as you say, it sounds like a big part of it is being able to see things from a user's perspective, not from a developer's point of view.
Yeah, and I don't know if you have seen any of those psychological experiments and fun videos where you see a lot of people, and one example is they are throwing a ball, and you're supposed to count how many times we throw that ball, or the people in the black t-shirts are throwing that ball together, so you are concentrating on how many times they pass the ball. But all of a sudden, there's a huge gorilla walking in the background, and then it walks out. And I think it's 47% of people, they do not see the gorilla because they are not expecting a gorilla there. And they're so concentrating on actually counting the number of times the ball passes from person to person. And that's kind of software development. If you put in the button, you will know that the button is there, but the user might not. It's very difficult to put yourself in the user's set of mind because you can never unsee the button, if you will. And the same thing goes for the gorilla. If you have seen the gorilla once, or if you didn't see it and I tell you there was a gorilla, then you will always see the gorilla. And that's exactly the same thing. If you put the button there, you will most probably not miss it. So it's kind of difficult to test your own stuff when it comes to UX. So it's good if you ask a friend or family member, or if you are lucky enough to actually have a UX team or a test team. Of course, that's even better.
I guess even if you're asking someone else, I can't remember the names of them, but you know those pictures where, depending on how you look at it, you can see two completely different images.
Yeah.
And different people looking at them would see one or the other depending on how they look at it. If you've got one other person that's not you, it feels like you need more than one user and just see not the average, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and are you a Mac person or a Windows person?
I'm Windows.
You're a Windows person. Okay. So If you have a Mac friend and they give you an iPad and they say, well, look in this application and start the video, it will take you longer time to realize how to navigate the YouTube app or whatever application it is. The interface itself is different. And your friend is getting frustrated or might get frustrated and like, but it's so intuitive. It's so easy. How can you miss this? And that's the exact same thing. You as a Windows person, it makes no sense to. But if you reverse it and your friend is going to do something on Windows, it will take that person longer time. So it's exactly like those pictures. What is it? It's like a duck and a frog or something?
I think there's a whole bunch of them, and you can stare at it, and then I think in the description it says, do you see this or this? And
yeah.
I see one, but then I've got to stare at it for a while, and then suddenly I can see it, and
yeah.
Then you can't see it the other way around.
Or the ones that animates and like a ballet person, and you don't know which way it's turning.
Yes.
Is it to you or... Yeah, our brains are amazing, but they're also very stupid.
They're also very different as well.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I've mentioned this on the podcast before. Something I learned about myself last year. There's something called aphantasia.
I have that.
You do too. So for the listeners, let's just explain what it is. And I didn't realise anyone that had this at all, like could do this at all. I literally learned it last year, but most people, if they close their eyes and they imagine a ball or a scene, they can actually see it, like in the mind's eye. But I think it's 3% of the population have aphantasia, where it's a blind mind's eye. And I had no idea that most people, the mind's eye was literal and people could actually see things.
No, me neither. I thought it was just an expression. Oh, I can see it. No, I can't.
Visualize a beach. Well, I didn't know people actually saw it.
No, exactly. And there's different degrees of aphantasia. There's a whole scale. You can have the complete blackness, and then you can have lack of colors and lack of details. And I think I'm somewhere in the middle. So I can pick up reference images in my head, but they can only last for half a second or even less than that, and then they're gone. If I'm going to get directions or something and they say go this way and turn right, if it's turned around in my head, I cannot switch it around. They have to like revert it for me because I have no idea. If this is straight for me, then you have to change it because I cannot see that in my head. Yeah, that's I learned that as well. I saw a video and like, what do you mean? People can actually see things?
So this spectrum you're talking about, so not being able to see anything is aphantasia, and basically being able to visualize very intensely, sometimes better than real life, is called hyperphantasia.
Yeah, my brother has that.
Funnily enough, my brother does too.
No way!
But it's interesting though, because I can't see anything in my mind's eye at all. I didn't know anyone could. But that sounds like there's nothing going on up top. When I do seem to be able to understand things very, very quickly, I'm not dependent on being able to see it. I think my mind works very conceptually, and I think also quite spatially. I think the scenario you described about being able to turn things around, I think I've kind of got the opposite of that. So if I'm going to use the word picturing, but obviously I'm not seeing anything. If I'm
imagining,
imagining, thinking about, but even imagining has got the word image in it.
Yeah.
But if I'm picturing being at my parents' house, I've got a 3D position in the scene. I'm very spatially aware of where things are. I just can't see colours or contours. I can't see anything. It's just information. And I thought that's how everyone thought until I learned about this aphantasia thing. So I think going back to the point, it's not just everyone thinks differently. Everyone's mind works intrinsically differently, as in fundamentally quite differently.
Yeah, and as humans, we have so many awesome stuff going on, like people who can actually imagine everything in great detail, but we also have limitations, like our attention span is like very limited for some people and slightly limited for another person. And we can see colors differently, and we have so many different aspects. We cannot do one thing and it will fit everyone. But we can try to find some happy medium. For me, that's a lot of what UX is. How can we get as many people as possible on board doing this so we don't exclude anyone? Because that's another thing. If we exclude people, like for instance, we are making a phone app and we're talking about, do we need to think about one-handed navigation? Well, no, nobody who's using this application has an amputated arm, so we don't need that. It's not our audience. Okay, but if we're taking it one step further, who else are you excluding? You are excluding people who have temporarily broken their arm or sprained their arm. You are excluding parents. They have a little baby on their arm, so you only have one hand, or anything else that is not an actual amputated arm. So we can't think like, well, that is not someone who is in my audience, because we will exclude so many people. And imagine if you were that one person who happened to have an amputated arm, they go and download your application and they can actually use it. How happy will they be that finally someone is thinking about them? So if we can make one person that happy, and also don't exclude the happy medium in between, that's for me perfect.
In the last episode with Kendra Havens talking about Visual Studio, one point near the end that came up was one feature they're looking at is adding audio cues to when tests pass or fail. And it sounds like such a trivial thing, just adding a bit of noise. But to someone that's partially sighted or blind, like there are blind developers, that's really important, because how do you know that otherwise?
Exactly. And that's another thing we should really take care of when we're doing, for instance, if we're doing web. If we are kind of just doing whatever we're used to or more comfortable with, or, well, I know there's an H1 and H2 tag, but it doesn't matter because I will restyle it anyway, so I can just use H1 all over the place, or I'm using a div instead for all my headers. That will mess up all the screen reading tools and will not help in hierarchy and what's what on the page. But if we actually use all the proper tags as they are intended, you can still restyle them. You can restyle them so everything looks exactly the same, is the same size, whatever, but a person who don't see as well and need that help will still be able to navigate your page. So we actually have a person who is blind in our user group, and he talked about this. Just use the proper tags and it will help me so much. He's developing in Visual Studio, as you said. So Visual Studio is doing a great job and they're trying to work on it even better, which I really like.
I just find that absolutely amazing that someone that is blind can actually do coding, because it's obviously so text-based. So I think it's amazing that this is being focused on, like in tools like Visual Studio and all this tooling, so that it kind of enables people that are partially sighted or whatever form of disability it is.
Yeah, and that's the same thing as before. We are not excluding anyone. So we are catching those people who are fully blind, but we're also catching everything in between. Maybe I'm just easily, my eyes get fatigued or whatever very easily. Then I can get that help as well. So just thinking about that. And actually, Microsoft, they came out with a booklet called Inclusive Design, which kind of shows a little... It makes you think.
I'll include that in the show notes as well.
They are showing things that make you think, like the example of the amputated arm. It's not only the extremes we are excluding, we're excluding everything in between. And if we can catch as many as possible, that's awesome.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting, like we're talking about people being blind or partially sighted, and initially, if I think about UX, I'm thinking visually on screen, when actually UX covers, like we've already spoken about, audible cues and other senses. It's not just sight.
Yeah, there's a lot of, not confusion, but conflicting information about UI and UX out there. You've probably seen the ketchup images where you have the glass bottle that says UI and you have the plastic squeezy ketchup bottle that says UX. But for me, that's not how it works. For me, both of them has a UI and both of them have a UX. So the UI is how it looks, how we can use it, but the UX is how we use it. Is it a good UX for me? Maybe I prefer the glass bottle because that's how I use it. Maybe I get ketchup all over the kitchen floor if I use the squeezy bottle, but for someone else, it's the other way around. So it doesn't matter if it's a good UX or a bad UX, it's still a UX, how we use the product or the software or what have you. And it doesn't help when we have titles called UX designer and things like that. That just helps with the confusion, I would say, that it's just putting pretty buttons and stuff on screen. But I would say that UX is more how we use the button. What happens when I click it? Does it look like I have clicked the button? Do the user understand that it's actually a button? And what happens when we click it? Where do I get then?
So earlier you mentioned about HTML attributes, which you need to add to help with this. But most web developers, they've not learned all this. Do you think the developers should have to versus HTML doing this automatically? Because it seems such an important thing. It feels like you should get it for free almost.
There's a lot of tools out there that you can use as a developer, plugins and just checkers. You can put in your URL and it will tell you what you need to work on. Maybe it's a contrast thing, so people might not be able to see it. Maybe it's a color deficiency thing, or maybe it's that you're not using the correct attributes. I know that for the web specifically, WCAG2 has a lot of tools for helping with accessibility guidelines and such for the web. And of course, most of the stuff for the web is applicable everywhere. You still need good contrast in your applications. Of course, you might not be using HTML, but there's a whole section just with tools for developers. So I would definitely recommend to check that out.
Feels like it'd be good to have like almost linting as part of CI/CD pipelines as well. So these tools, if that's an explicit manual action, but if you can actually into your build pipeline have these checks as well.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Or at least in your definition of done, so you actually check for usability. Because if it helps someone, it's kind of like we think of it sometimes as a thing we have to do to include people. Oh, there might be someone who can't see colors. We need to fix that. No, you need to fix it so everyone can use it. If we do that mind shift set in the beginning, so instead of thinking that we need to help these poor people, just think about having a great UX, having everybody on board. We don't have to segregate out a certain ability or disability, because if there's someone who can't see color properly, the person who actually can see colors, they can still use the application if you use the proper colors, right? So it doesn't have to be something we think about in the end. It should be something we start to think about from the beginning. Is it usable? Can everybody use this? Are we excluding someone? And then we will save so much time and money and code and what have you, because we thought about that from the beginning.
You mentioned earlier about tooling. What other kind of tooling do we have for things like prototyping and all this kind of stuff?
Actually, it doesn't matter how you prototype, or if you just do a rough sketch on a napkin, or if you want to do full-on Photoshop stuff, as long as you think things through. I think sometimes, especially when we learn a new trait or try to incorporate something new, we want the best software or the coolest software or the best experience. But sometimes we can just take a step back. The whole point of wireframing and prototyping and all of that is to put down outside of your head what is going to happen when you click on this button. How will the user find the button or page, or how will they navigate? Do we have too much information on the page? Can we perhaps remove something and put it in the secondary place? Of course, in a perfect world, we will have designers, we will have a UX team, we will have an accessibility team, but sometimes we do not have that. So it's better to just do one thing. Just start with one thing. You don't have to make it perfect, but if you start with one thing, things will just snowball from there and people will get so much happier. But my absolute favorite UX tool is an evaluation tool called Tenets and Traps. It is a deck of cards. It is literally a deck of cards. And I hate to say this so Jimmy can hear this. So Jimmy is my husband, for those who don't know. So he is a developer. He's a backend developer. And well, now he's a web developer as well. He was so bad at UX and UI. It's not even funny. I mean, it was bad. But then I started to talk about UX, and I found this system called Tenets and Traps, and he has that deck of cards, and he is now responsible for UX at his company because of a deck of cards. Because sometimes we just need rules that are simplified, kind of like the solid principles, right? It might be common sense for some people. But for some of us, we need to have that bare minimum boiled down for us. So we have some sort of structure to adhere to. And the Tenets and Traps, they do that. They have taken hundreds of years of UI research. They have taken into account all the amazing research that Donald Norman and Jakob Nielsen and all the UX rules and laws, and there's hundreds of those. So they have taken all that research, and with they, I mean Michael Medlock and Steve Herbst. And they have boiled everything down to what they call tenets and traps. So tenets is good things about UX. For instance, we have responsive, that's good. We have understandable, well, that's good too. Efficient, again, that's something we want. And then they have traps, and that's common mistakes that we might be able to fix. So for instance, if we have responsive, a trap there would be slow or no response. Obviously, that's not responsive. And what I really like about these cards is that they have a description in plain English. So it's nothing, it should feel like a summer breeze or anything that you might interpret differently from time to time. And on the backside, they actually have a real life example. So they can show you in this web, they're using this and this instead of whatever the trap is. So basically, avoid the traps and you will have an awesome UX.
I think I might order one of those. In fact, I might order 2 if this is okay with you. I'll order 2, and if any of our listeners would like one of those, then send a tweet out, mention the podcast, mention the Tenets and Traps deck of cards, and the first person to do it, I will send my second purchase off to.
That's fantastic. I like that it's so, how should I put it? It's logical. If you remove this, you will have a better UX. If you do this, it will be good. If you do this, you will have an issue. So I like that it's comprehensible, it's plain English, so it's very easy to use, especially if you work with teams. So I teach UX, and an example was they were doing a project, and they were for 4 people. And they talked about it in the beginning. We want this and that on the page, and it should feel luxurious and light. And then when it came down to actually doing the colors, 2 of them, because they didn't actually skip the step of doing a prototype and all of that, so they did not put it down outside of their head. Since they interpreted differently, 2 of them wanted cream color, and 2 of them wanted a medium gray. Now, for the people who chose the cream color, the medium gray was dark to them. And they said luxurious and light. So they butted heads over what was light and luxurious. I actually don't know what they ended up picking, because there is no right or wrong, right? If you are expecting a black page, then a medium gray would be light. But for someone who's expecting a white page, a cream would be light. So if we are actually communicating with our coworkers and our team, it's so much easier. And if we have a clear way of doing that and not saying things like it should feel or light and luxurious, or if we just put it down in real world examples, like I want a blue page or I want it to work like this. And I think this actually helps with that. That's why I like it, because it's plain English. So yeah, I like that.
I think 'cause a lot of this is, to a point, quite subjective, but it's also a science behind it. It feels
Yeah.
like, I suppose, moving on to another topic, which is more like once your website is out in the wild,
Mm.
getting telemetry, maybe doing A/B kind of testing. What do you find is the best way to actually get that information and do something with it?
It's all, again, depending on your experience and how you work and what kind of budget you have. And there's plenty of awesome pages. I think one is called Hoitar or something. I know Facebook does this, if there's anyone actually using Facebook still, but they do this. They put out a new version of their page, but they only put it out for like 500,000 people. And if they get feedback that it's very bad, they go back and they try another one. But if they don't get any bad feedback, they put on another million people and try it again and see if they get any bad feedback. If they don't get any bad feedback, everybody gets it. So that's one way of testing it. Or you can do A/B testing. Like you said, you have two versions of the same page. Try it out, see what people think. And there's a lot of cool stuff you can do. Heat mapping and see if people actually interact with the page as you expected. If you can do that, that would be amazing. But sometimes we don't have that opportunity. Sometimes we just have to do that ourselves as developers. And of course, that's more difficult. But it's good if you're a small company and you don't have a huge developer team, maybe you can ask someone else in the organization to actually try the page, sit behind them and see where all the swear words comes. That's a great way to figure out what's bugging people, and you can remove that impediment. I find that easier to find out what the user need if you actually just basically sit quietly behind them and watch them work. Because if you ask them straight out, would you prefer this or that? They think that they need to be in this box. You have a certain rules, or it has always worked like this, therefore I cannot go outside of the box, right? So they think that they need to answer something, or they think that they need something, but it turns out that it's not even the best way to perform their work. And that's something I really, really like with doing that sort of testing with actual users, because sometimes the user don't even know what they need, because we are so colored by the restrictions we have today. I have seen systems that are amazing that people even got work done. And when they were asked, what do you need? They answered, well, we have these three systems that are completely not even talking to each other. They had to print out papers and put it in a basket, and the basket, someone had to put in the numbers from those printed papers into another system by hand. Imagine how many errors that will be. And when they were asked what they need, they wanted another paper bin so they didn't have to walk that long. So they wanted more paper bins. But what they actually ended up getting was a connected system that could take those numbers directly into the database. So they did not know that they could ask for that. So sometimes we just need to sit and listen and see where the frustrations are.
Yeah, I guess this comes to the how technical someone is as well. And well, not just technical, just implied knowledge as a developer. But you mentioned before about, am I a Windows user or a Mac user? And then if I went to Mac, it wouldn't be intuitive. But whether I go to Windows or Mac, I'm looking at it from the point of view of someone that's quite technical. So I suppose depending on what your application is,
Yeah.
if the target audience is someone that's non-technical, then the person you want to try it on is maybe someone at home that's not technical, or just don't send it to another developer just because they didn't work on that feature.
Exactly. I have a great example of exactly that. My mom, she is as untechnical as they come. Well, I should actually use that as past tense, but I mean, if you looked up not technical, you would see a picture of my mom. To the extent that back in Windows 98, maybe, you had three themes. You had the blue, you could have a chrome color, and you could have a olive green. Now, this was back in the day when you actually had to reformat your computer every now and then, or do all of that stuff that Windows kind of do for you today. And I live kind of far from my mother, but my brother, he is as technical as they come. He is 10 years younger than me, and he was basically born into the computer world. So he was the one who got all the tech support. So he usually fixed her computer. And the only thing my mom did was play those mini games like Peggle, or basically all the tiny games we play on our cell phones nowadays, she played on the computer. So she calls me very upset one day and said that my brother has ruined her computer. And I was like, yeah, but he wouldn't do that. So what's the problem? Well, he's removed all my games. He must have reformatted, because she knew that reformat means no games. And I said, well, then he will be back tomorrow, because again, this was back in the day when everything took like an age to reinstall. Because there's no reason he would get there and redo all this stuff and not give her the games that she plays, because she did nothing else. So I actually tried to remote into the computer, and hint number one, I could. So that's the first thing. And then I realized, okay, I don't know how she start the games, because you could either click on the start menu, go up to all programs and do it that way, or you can have them on the desktop, like shortcut. And I did not know how she did. So she told me that she usually pressed on the flag and D. With a flag, she means the Windows button. So she meant the desktop. And I was looking at the actual games on the desktop, and I asked her, where do you usually click? Because I know my brother is kind of a neat freak, so maybe he moved them around and sorted them and she couldn't find them. No, they were exactly where they used to be. But he changed the theme from blue to green. And she could not see them because she was not expecting it to be green. So that's how untechnical my mom is. Now, if we fast forward a couple of years, she got a Windows 8 computer from us. And she went back home, and I didn't really have time to show her the ropes and all of that. So I thought maybe she won't use the computer and there will be a lot of support calls, and maybe I just need to go down there and fix it. Turns out she had no issues at all, because this was Windows 8. She understood that if it was a huge envelope, that's her email. If it was a game, that opened the game. So for her, that was more intuitive, if you will. Now, I mentioned that my brother is very technical. My mom needed a new router, and my brother comes over with a new router and connects it. And all of a sudden, since Windows 8, my mother was getting kind of excited about computers and how it worked, because she started to understand how it worked a little. And she was following him around like a dog, like, oh, you connect that? Is that where internet comes from? And kind of excited. And all of a sudden, my brother says, well, you can go and drink coffee now. And she's like, we're not done. No, but this will take some time. But we're not done. No, but you see, Microsoft has ruined Windows with Windows 8. And she's like, okay. Because she knows I use Windows 8 and I haven't complained. So she just leaves it and says, but what are we trying to do? Well, Microsoft has moved all the settings. So it's super difficult to find all the network settings and stuff like that. But what do we need to do? She's really getting frustrated. And he says, we need to put in your password for your Wi-Fi. And she was using Windows, the first version, 8.0. So she goes to the computer, which is a touch computer. She swipes from the right to the left, opens the charm bar, clicks on the network settings, and says, you mean here? And my brother, his jaw just dropped.
Oh, I love that.
So my very untechnical mother could find it, but my brother couldn't, because he is used to having it in a different part of the system. And he did not use the charms bar, which you couldn't see back then. Now you can see it, but back then you couldn't. So that's the same thing there. It all depends on how you see it, and if you expect things or not. So today she's very technical. She runs a couple of Facebook groups and do all sorts of things. So, which I think Windows 8 for.
Well, I found it interesting where you mentioned about the 98 thing where just changing the color theme made it so she couldn't see it. Because I actually thought you were going to say that he moved the shortcut somewhere else, so it wasn't there. But the fact just changing the color was enough, which really highlights what we were saying before about colors.
Yeah, exactly. And also expectations. In all of her computer time, she has only seen the game names being blue. So all of a sudden, everything was green. They did not exist. That was something else. It's things like that. And I find it so interesting that our brains work like that. Because to me, it was easy because I don't care what color it is. But if you're not expecting the color, it's fantastic how our brains work.
I guess also if you're maybe a bit not scared, that's a too strong a word, but you know what I mean? It's if you're a little bit scared of computers anyway and technology, then it's kind of like
you don't want to click it to break something, maybe?
Exactly, yeah. Or you're just not used, because we're used to seeing computers all the time, so it's kind of we'll spot things that are different, and you're just used to it, as you say. So it's largely about what you're used to.
What you said about intuitive. Now, if you look up intuitive, it's a lot of feelings involved, again, because it feels like something is just happening without conscious reasoning. How do you code that to so many different brains? Well, you can't really. You just have to make sure that you use the standardized ways of doing things. Maybe use the toolings that are available for it. Maybe use the platform buttons so it actually looks like a platform button and things like that. Just if there's a standard, try to use it.
Yeah, that sounds very, very good advice. UX is something that I do need to get better at. I just need to. I've recently resubscribed to O'Reilly, so I can read any of the tech books.
But that's the thing. The books, some of the books, they are just like, it should feel like this, or they're very fluffy, as I call it. They're not anything like do this or do that, or maybe you can think of this. It's open for so much interpretation, and I don't like that. I think UX has a UX problem. I mean, there's really good books, like Don Norman has a book called The Psychology of Every... No, it's called The Design of Everyday Things. It used to be called The Psychology of Everyday Things, which I like because there's a lot of psychology going into UX, but they had to change the name to The Design of Everyday Things because everybody put it in the psychology section and not the design section. So again, it had a UX problem. But that's more like, don't put the spout of the teapot so you will burn yourself kind of things. And doors that open inwards should not have this funny handle that looks like you should pull it. How do you put that into software? That's why I like Tenets and Traps so much, because it's more like hands-on. I think the Jensen group is one of the best. They have kind of like tidbits. Don't put things close to each other because then we don't know if it's like for informs for radio buttons. If you put them too close together, they are a group. They shouldn't be a group. So they have a lot of good stuff. The Jensen group, I think it's called, yeah. But sometimes it's so much fluff. I went to a UX class once, a UX workshop at a developer conference, and the person doing the class, he said it was for developers. I beg to differ, because it's, again, so much fluff. And he said, well, as a developer, you need to know at least 24 of the UX laws out there. So there's a lot of Fitts law and what you have. You need to know and study at least 24 of those. And I call bull. Why should a developer have to study UX as a UXer? There should be an easier version saying use pagination instead of a massive list of stuff, or more hands-on practical examples. I prefer that for developers because we can't be best at everything, right? And is it a developer? Should it be put on a developer to study UX like a UXer? I don't know. Sometimes a developer just need to take a deep breath, forget about the backlog, and remember that there's a user. And usually that helps a lot.
Yeah, I guess a big part of it is just thinking about it in the first place, which a lot of developers just don't.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just having that awareness.
Yeah. Could my mom navigate this? Or my grandfather or my baby or whatever it is. Like, could someone else do this? It's just take a deep breath and everything will be fine.
Yeah, what's the whole thing? Can you explain something to a 5-year-old?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, yes, I love that.
I can't remember where that's from, actually. Who said that?
No, me neither, but I love it. And I've heard it. You should be able to explain it to like a 4 or 5-year-old in a minute and they would understand
I'm going to Google it. Explain it to our 5-year-old. Yeah, so this quote is actually by Albert Einstein, apparently. If you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself.
Yeah, I love that because it's so true. And that's it goes hand in hand with the Donner-Kruger effect. Because when you just start to learn something, you might think you know everything, but then you talk to people like Mads Torgensen or anyone like that, and they say, well, I kind of don't know C#. Look, you don't know C#? You've written the damn thing. It's like, what? Because he understands that he doesn't know everything. Because the more you know, and I think that's basically the same saying in a different way, isn't it?
There's the other saying of, the more you know, the more you realize what you don't know.
Exactly. That's classic Donner-Kruger. It's called something like that, right? Am I quoting that right?
I don't know, actually. One sec.
Donner-Kruger. Yes, the Donner-Kruger effect. Dunning-Kruger.
Oh,
Dunning-Kruger.
Yes. I can see funky graphs and things.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh no, the Valley of Despair.
Yeah. So when you start realizing that you don't know
So for the listeners, looking at the chart for the Dunning-Kruger effect, so the Y is confidence and the X is competence. And on the left-hand side, it's shooting up really fast, saying peak of Mount Stupidity. Then it drops down really fast and goes to Valley of Despair. But then it slowly goes up, saying slope of enlightenment. And at the top, plateau of sustainability.
Yeah.
That initial peak is like right on the left-hand side of the X-axis.
Yeah, and I feel like that goes kind of hand in hand with, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, as Einstein said, then you don't know it.
Although I wouldn't like to explain Git to my 5 and 7-year-old.
No.
But I feel I understand it though, so maybe.
Well, maybe you're just on that curve.
What, the Valley of Despair? I think you're right.
That's fantastic. Oh my gosh, this is going good.
So before we do wrap up, instead of doing the usual dev tips, I'm going to turn the tables a bit, because I know that in your podcast, normally you ask 2 questions, which I'm going to steal from you and fire right back at you. And you know what's coming, don't you? But first one, Marvel or DC?
Marvel, hands down. No question about it. And we're winning on our podcast. Marvel is winning.
Oh, you've got a poll going.
We have a poll. We have asked these questions. We have added to the questions. Nowadays, we have a few more. But yes, I might have a poll.
Oh, we're going to see the stats for that. Can we put the stats in the podcast show notes?
Oh, maybe we can. We haven't put it up yet. On our webpage, but we definitely need to fix that.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think I'm like straddling both, to be honest, because I think growing up, my 2 favorite superheroes were Superman and Spider-Man.
Yeah, mine was Batman and Spider-Man.
So then you're straddling both too.
No, because we have Spider-Man, of course, we have Deadpool, and we have the Avengers, and and DC have Ambush Bug. Do you know what his superpower is?
Nope, not heard of him.
His insanity and teleportation. Come on.
That sounds amazing.
And also Batman, he has a shark repellent spray. Batman, come on.
I've never understood the Batman thing where he goes up against Superman. Batman's impressive, but it's a human being, so it's kind of...
Yeah. No, I like both, but I prefer DC. Oh my gosh, cut it out. Don't send that to Jimmy. I prefer Marvel.
Oh, I'm going to have to keep that, I'm afraid. But I just remembered, I remember putting on Facebook a photo of my youngest son. He's got like these superhero model things, and he had Batman and the Incredible Hulk. I walked into the room and he had the Incredible Hulk lying down on the floor with Batman stood on him. And I put on the Facebook post saying, how do I explain to, I think it was 2 at the time or something, how do I explain to a 2-year-old that is an unlikely scenario?
I love it.
Oh, I'll have to dig that picture up and put it on the show notes as well.
Yeah. Maybe Batman had like a radiation spray or a weakening spray or something. I don't know. He has all kinds of gadgets. But still
Maybe.
Unlikely.
So the second question, what was your first computer?
Oh, it's just a boring answer. I don't even know the specs of it. It ran Windows 3.11 for like a week or two, and then it went over to Windows 95. So it's boring answer.
I think mine was VIC-20 and BBC.
Oh, nice.
My dad, he was a teacher, so he didn't... It's funny, actually, where you're saying about your mum not being very technical. Neither my mum or dad are technical at all. And yet, when I was a kid, he used to bring computers home, so a bit weird. But I think it's because he was a teacher, so he just had to do them. But he brought them home when I'd get to play around before we actually got our own computer.
Nice. Yeah, my cousin had a VIC-20. We played games on.
It's a good computer, I think. VIC-20, BBC, and then Amiga was my first proper computer.
Yeah. Yeah, I was a late bloomer.
I'm just old. Right, so before we wrap up, where's the best place for listeners to reach out if they have any questions?
That would probably be Twitter, Engstrom Jess.
Well, we can certainly include links to like all your social places in the show notes as well.
Awesome, thank you.
So a big, massive thank you for joining us. It's been amazing having you on.
Thank you, it's been fun.
And I just remind everyone to go and listen to Coding After Work. It's a really, really good podcast. I've been really enjoying it. And thank you everyone for listening. A quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company, providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter at Dracan, Dracan, and my DMs are open. And my blog, danclark.com, has links to all my social stuff too. And we will include links to all the stuff we've spoken about today in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.